Thank you all, and good afternoon. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about something that I spend a lot of my time working on, which is Taiwan, and really what the Chinese military, the PLA, is doing around Taiwan. And just to kind of frame all of this, I think it's important to note that, for this panel being on China competition, I think Taiwan is one of the issues really at the core of U.S.-China tensions today, and the Chinese would agree with that. Just a few weeks ago when Xi Jinping met with President Biden, Xi listed 4 red lines that China has in U.S.-China relations, and the first one that he listed was Taiwan, and listing that first was not an accident. It really has been at the core of these tensions, and I think that that's likely to persist going forward. So what I thought I would do is really focus concretely on a couple of things that we've been observing in terms of China's activities towards Taiwan recently. And from that, I want to conclude with 3 points about where I think that tells us things are going forward. So I think, first of all, I want to focus on some of the recent activities that the PLA did in October of this year when they held what they called Joint Sword 2024B military exercises around Taiwan. So on October 10th, Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te gave his National Day speech. This is something that's a long-held tradition that Taiwan's leaders do every year to mark this date. And typically there's not much fanfare around it, but this year there was a lot of attention paid because there was a strong likelihood that China would launch these large-scale military exercises as an escalation against the speech. And that's exactly what they did. 4 days after Lai gave his speech, the PLA initiated large-scale exercises, and that day saw record levels of PLA activity around Taiwan. Over 100 aircraft sorties flying around Taiwan, record numbers of naval activity as well. And I think, taking a step back from that, even ahead of that, we've seen a dramatic uptick in PLA activity before this began. So back in May of this year, after Lai's inauguration, China did Joint Sword 2024A, which signaled to all of us watching the PLA that this would happen again, and that's exactly what they've done. And in the summer, too, I think they were signaling ahead of this that the PLA was going to be really active. We saw a significant amount of signaling, specifically, I think, focused on signaling to the United States. Just a few days before these exercises started, China launched a DF-31 ICBM into the Pacific Ocean. That's something they had not done since 1980. So a clear signal from Beijing that the PLA is going to be playing a big role now and going forward. The second lesson I think we drew from that was that the Coast Guard, China's Coast Guard, is increasingly an important part of what they're doing. And so we saw record levels of Coast Guard activity involved with these PLA operations as well. Taiwan's Ministry of Defense reported, I think, 17 Coast Guard vessels operating around Taiwan, but our team at CSIS was able to use AIS ship tracking data to show that if you widen that scope just a little bit, there were actually 33 vessels, at least 33 vessels operating around Taiwan and some of the areas around that, including Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands that are disputed, as well as some of Taiwan's additional outlying islands. So I think take that together and you see, over 30 Coast Guard vessels operating alongside a few dozen other PLA vessels. And really what that tells us is that China is preparing for a range of activities beyond just invasion. And really, the Coast Guard would likely be involved in something like a quarantine or blockade. And we see them out, doing the exact kind of operations to prepare for those kinds of activities. So I think that was the second major lesson from that activity. And I think one of the third things that we saw that was pretty interesting and somewhat new was the involvement of China really engaging some of its key partners at the same time that it was conducting these exercises. And specifically, we see signs that China is increasingly looking to engage with what some might call the axis of authoritarians or the axis of upheaval, which includes, in addition to China, includes Russia, North Korea, and Iran. So the same day that these exercises were occurring, Russia's defense minister was in Beijing meeting with China's defense minister, and the next day was meeting with the vice chairman of China's military commission, Central Military Commission, Zhang Youxia. This is a first, in all of the exercises that we've been tracking over the years. This is the first time that we saw major high-level China-Russia joint activity occurring at the same times as these exercises. It's impossible to say for sure that that was intentional timing, but I think even if it wasn't, quite striking to see Beijing and Moscow engaging on these issues at the same time that China is conducting such major operations around Taiwan, and of course, not to mention Russia is involved in the war in Ukraine. So I want to just quickly wrap up, because I think we're looking forward to getting to discussion and Q&A, but just drawing from these three kind of lessons that I've learned, I want to project a little bit more into the future and think about what this tells us about what we can see from China and China's military around Taiwan going forward. The first is I really think that we can expect more PLA activity going forward. And in fact, we know this. China's defense ministry during these exercises said that they will do this again. Anytime that they see a perceived provocation from Taiwan, they will use the PLA to send a message. And in fact, we may see that in the coming days. Taiwan's president right now is returning from about a week-long trip abroad, during which he transited through the United States, Hawaii, and Guam. And China has reacted to this in the past with major exercises. So stay on the news next week, and you may see the PLA conducting Joint SOAR 2024C. And by and large, I think, more broadly, we're going to see the PLA more engaged. I think as the PLA's capabilities are growing, Beijing feels more comfortable using the PLA as a tool for political signaling and deterrent signaling, especially against the United States. Second big point that I want to mention is, again, this issue of quarantining and blockading. Of course, much of the discourse here in Washington revolves around when is D-Day, when is the PLA going to invade? Of course, we need to take seriously the threat that the PLA, that Xi Jinping and the CCP could decide that hope for a peaceful unification is lost and that they need to take action. And of course, an invasion is one option they can take. But it's also clear from the activities that they've been taking in recent months, really since August of 2022, a blockade and a quarantine is certainly on the table in terms of an option that Beijing could take. And that's important for U.S. planners, it's important for Taipei, it's also important for U.S. allies in terms of how we prepare for various contingencies, and it'll impact the kind of decisions we need to make on training, on operational readiness, on capabilities, and on force planning. Because the kind of forces you need to respond to something like a Coast Guard-led quarantine are quite different from something that you need to engage Beijing in a full-scale invasion. And number three, I think this big question is, again, about how China may be engaging partners like Russia. Will Russia be sticking its nose a little bit closer to Taiwan? So far, I think that's something that Russia has not necessarily wanted to get involved in because it has its own issues going on in Ukraine. But we are seeing steady willingness from Beijing to engage Russia and some other partners on this. And I think just this week, for example, we see a Russian submarine and naval warship operating near the Japanese island of Yonaguni, which is not far from Taiwan. So we're seeing Russians, and the Russians have engaged in a record number of joint military exercises with China in just this year alone. So we're seeing them step up their involvement with each other. We're seeing Russia engage in the Western Pacific, potentially getting closer to Taiwan in ways that are concerning. And so I think that this is a really important thing for Washington and Taipei to kind of continue to watch going forward. And then I think just to wrap up, I think why is this all important? Of course, we know you hear record daily why Taiwan is important. You think about chips. You think about the humanitarian need to protect this island of 23 million people. Why else does it matter? I just want to conclude with one recent bit of research that we put out at CSIS, which is tracking the amount of trade that goes through the Taiwan Strait. Our data people at CSIS helped us crunch these numbers and found that over $2.5 trillion worth of goods passed through the Taiwan Strait in 2022, which is about a fifth of all maritime traffic. So take aside what Taiwan itself, its importance and its criticality to the global economy. The Taiwan Strait, too, is a critical part of global commerce. So it doesn't take just an invasion to upset that delicate balance. a blockade, a quarantine, or other activities could upset that balance and could create a lot of headaches for not just the governments and capitals around the world, but also the businesses that depend on that for the lifeblood of the economy. So with that, I'll wrap up and looking forward to the rest of this panel. Thank you.
Great. Thank